I'm Emily, 28 years old, and I just stood there calmly watching my parents burn what they thought was a $9 million check from my beloved Grandpa Robert's will. The orange flames devoured the paper as they smirked triumphantly, thinking they'd destroyed my inheritance. What they didn't know was why I smiled through their entire performance. Grief for Grandpa still weighed on my heart, but seeing their greed blind them to what was really happening gave me a strange satisfaction. Before I reveal why I smiled when they burned that check, let me know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe if you've ever dealt with family who only saw dollar signs where there should have been love. Growing up in a middle-class suburb just outside Boston, my childhood looked normal from the outside. Our two-story colonial with its neatly trimmed hedges and freshly painted shutters fit right in with the neighborhood aesthetic my parents, Thomas and Diana, desperately wanted to maintain. But inside those walls, everything was about appearances, status, and how much things cost. My father worked in finance, not quite making the big money he always dreamed of, but doing well enough to fuel my mother's obsession with designer labels and country club memberships. They stretched every dollar to create the illusion of wealth, maxing out credit cards for vacations they couldn't afford, and leasing luxury cars they had to struggle to pay for each month. It's all about who you know and how they see you. My father would lecture whenever I questioned why we needed to spend so much on things that didn't seem important. My mother would add, "First impressions are everything, Emily. People judge you by what you have." From an early age, I just didn't share their values. While my parents spent Sundays at networking brunches, I'd be fascinated by the birds in our backyard or lost in library books about faraway places. This fundamental difference created a distance between us that grew wider with each year. They couldn't understand why I didn't care about the things that consumed their every waking thought. Grandpa Robert was my sanctuary. My father's father lived about 30 minutes away in a modest farmhouse that had been in the family for generations. Every Saturday, from when I was 6 years old, I'd spend the day with him while my parents attended their social events. Those Saturdays quickly became the highlight of my week. Unlike the pristine, magazine-worthy rooms of our house, Grandpa's home was lived in and real. Bookshelves overflowed with well-read volumes. His workshop smelled of wood shavings and varnish. The kitchen always had something delicious simmering on the stove. It wasn't fancy, but it felt more like home than my actual house ever did. "Come see what I found for us today, Stargazer," he'd call when I arrived, using his special nickname for me after discovering my fascination with the night sky. One memorable Saturday when I was 8, he unveiled an old telescope he'd found at an estate sale. "It needs some work," he said, eyes twinkling with excitement. "But I figure you and I could fix it up together." For the next month of Saturdays, we carefully cleaned, repaired, and adjusted that telescope. Grandpa taught me how to use proper tools, the importance of patience, and the satisfaction of bringing something back to life with your own hands. When we finally set it up on his back porch and I saw the rings of Saturn for the first time, I gasped in wonder. "The universe is full of miracles, Emily," he said softly, his hand on my shoulder. "But the greatest miracle is having someone to share them with." Grandpa filled my childhood with these kinds of moments. While my parents taught me about designer labels and social climbing, he taught me about constellations, history, and craftsmanship. He shared stories of his youth, working on farms during the Depression, serving in the Korean War, falling in love with my grandmother who had passed before I was born. "Money comes and goes," he told me once while we were sanding a bookshelf. "We were building together. But knowledge, skills, and character stay with you forever." The contrast between these warm, meaningful exchanges and my parents' increasingly distant relationship with Grandpa became more apparent as I grew older. They would make obligatory visits on holidays, rushing through them with transparent impatience. My father would often check his watch repeatedly, while my mother would make thinly veiled comments about the quaint and rustic nature of Grandpa's home. "I don't understand why he won't sell this place and move into something more appropriate for his age," she'd whisper loudly enough for everyone to hear. And all these old things must be full of dust and germs. Grandpa would just smile knowingly and wink at me when they weren't looking. When I was accepted to college to study environmental science, my parents were disappointed I hadn't chosen business or law. But Grandpa showed up at my dorm with a handmade desk he'd crafted specially for me. "For all those important studies," he said, running his weathered hand along the smooth surface. "Your grandmother always said education is the one thing nobody can take from you." Throughout my undergraduate years and then my master's program, Grandpa remained my biggest supporter. While my parents complained about the lack of prospects in my chosen field, he would listen intently as I explained my research on watershed conservation or forest management. "The world needs more people who care about something bigger than themselves," he'd say. "I'm proud of you, stargazer." After graduating, I secured a position with an environmental research institute in Boston. It allowed me to stay close to Grandpa while starting my career. We still maintained our Saturday tradition, though now I often drove him to local nature preserves where I could show him the practical applications of my work. During the last year of his life, our conversations sometimes took a more serious turn. He began sharing family stories with greater urgency, as if ensuring I would remember them. "There's more than one kind of inheritance, Emily," he told me during what would be our final autumn together, as we watched leaves spiral down from his maple trees. "Some things are written on paper, but the most important things are written on the heart." I didn't know then that he was preparing me for what was to come. The first signs of Grandpa Robert's decline came subtly. He forgot our regular chess game one Saturday. The garden he meticulously maintained each spring lay partially planted. His stories, once vivid with detail, occasionally trailed off into silence as he searched for words that once came easily. By winter, he reluctantly agreed to see a doctor after I found him confused about what day it was. The diagnosis hit me like a physical blow: advanced pancreatic cancer that had already spread to his liver. The prognosis was 6 months, possibly less. "Don't look so worried, stargazer," he said, squeezing my hand as we left the oncologist's office. "I've had 84 wonderful years. That's more than many get." His pragmatism in the face of death only made me admire him more. While he agreed to some palliative treatments to manage pain, he refused aggressive interventions that would diminish his quality of life. "I'd rather have 3 good months than 6 miserable ones," he explained. I immediately reorganized my work schedule to part-time so I could help care for him. We established a routine: mornings for medications and doctor appointments, afternoons for sitting in his favorite chair by the window where he could watch birds at the feeder, evenings for reading aloud from his favorite books when his eyes grew too tired to focus on the pages. The most difficult days were when pain broke through the medications, leaving him pale and breathless. But even then, he never complained. Instead, he would ask about my work, my friends, my dreams for the future, steering the conversation away from his suffering. My parents' reaction to Grandpa's illness was both predictable and infuriating. For months, they had barely called or visited him. My father would make excuses about being swamped at work, while my mother always seemed to have some social engagement that couldn't possibly be rescheduled. But when I informed them that his condition had significantly worsened, their interest suddenly rekindled. "We should visit more often," my father announced during a rare family dinner. "Family needs to stick together during difficult times." My mother nodded vigorously. "I'll bring some of those imported chocolates he always liked." I almost choked on my water. "He never liked those, Mom." "You're thinking of Uncle Steve. Grandpa prefers peppermint candies from the local drugstore." She waved dismissively. "Well, we should bring something nice anyway. Show him we care." Their version of showing care manifested in increasingly transparent ways. Suddenly, they began making weekly visits, arriving with expensive gifts that Grandpa had no use for: a cashmere sweater too fine for his practical tastes, crystal decanters for a man who rarely drank, a Swiss watch when his trusty Timex had served him perfectly for decades. During these visits, they would pepper their conversation with not-so-subtle references to his house and possessions. "This land must be worth quite a bit now, with all the development in the area," my father commented once, gazing out the window at Grandpa's 5 acres of woods and meadow. "And some of these antiques look quite valuable," my mother added, running her fingers over a cherry wood cabinet that had belonged to my great-grandmother. I would catch Grandpa's eye during these exchanges, and he would give me the slightest shake of his head, signaling me not to confront them. After they left, he never remarked on their behavior directly, but I could tell their transparent motives saddened him. One evening, after my parents had departed following a particularly obvious fishing expedition about Grandpa's financial affairs, I couldn't contain my frustration any longer. "How can you stand it?" I asked him, straightening the pillows they had disturbed on the sofa. "They barely visited you when you were well, and now they're circling like vultures." Grandpa took my hand and pulled me gently to sit beside him. "Emily, I've lived long enough to see people clearly for who they are. Your father was raised with everything he needed, but somewhere along the way, he decided it wasn't enough. He and your mother built their lives around wanting more. Always more." He sighed, his eyes distant with memory. "It's a kind of poverty, in its way, never being satisfied with what you have. I've known rich misers and happy paupers. Money just makes you more of what you already are." Then he looked at me intently, his blue eyes still sharp despite his illness. "Don't worry about me, stargazer. I know exactly what's happening, and I've made my arrangements accordingly." As Grandpa's condition deteriorated further, he was eventually hospitalized. The sterile environment seemed to drain him more quickly than the disease itself. I brought items from home to personalize his room, his favorite quilt, photographs of his beloved woods in different seasons, a small wooden carving of an owl we had made together years ago. My parents' visits to the hospital were brief, performative, and always followed by hushed conversations in the hallway that they thought I couldn't hear. "The lawyer says he can't discuss the will while Robert is still alive," my father whispered, urgently one afternoon. "Did you ask about the property?" my mother replied. "That's the real prize. We could sell it to that developer who's been buying up all the land in that area." I walked away before I could hear more, physically sickened by their callousness. Grandpa passed peacefully on a clear spring morning, with me holding his hand. His last words to me were, "Remember to look up at the stars, Emily. I'll be watching with you." The funeral was well attended, a testament to the many lives Grandpa had touched in his quiet way. Neighbors, former colleagues, friends from his volunteer work at the local historical society, all came to pay their respects with genuine tears and heartfelt stories. My parents performed grief with practiced precision. My mother dabbed at dry eyes with a black handkerchief, while my father accepted condolences with a solemn expression that disappeared the moment people turned away. During the reception afterward, I overheard them discussing with my uncle how quickly the estate could be settled. That evening, alone in my apartment, I finally allowed myself to fully feel the loss. I cried for hours, clutching the small wooden star Grandpa had carved for me when I was 10. Unlike my parents' theatrical display, my grief was raw and real, a testament to the genuine bond we had shared. 2 days after the funeral, the call came from James Wilson, Grandpa's attorney and longtime friend. The preliminary assessment of Grandpa's estate had been completed, and the results were surprising to everyone except perhaps me. Robert's investments were quite substantial, Mr. Wilson explained. Conservative but exceptionally well managed over decades. The total estate value is approximately $15.2 million. When my parents heard this news, their already intense interest escalated dramatically. My mother began calling me daily, asking if I'd heard anything about the will. Eating. My father suddenly remembered countless special moments with Grandpa that he felt compelled to reminisce about over lengthy phone calls. Their newfound dedication to Grandpa's memory might have been comical if it weren't so transparently mercenary. The wolves weren't just at the door anymore. They were putting on sheep's clothing and practicing their bleeding. 2 weeks after Grandpa's funeral, we gathered at the law offices of Wilson and Associates for the official reading of the will. The office occupied the top floor of a historic brick building in downtown Boston, with views of the harbor through tall windows. The conference room where we assembled featured dark wood paneling, leather chairs, and a massive table that gleamed under soft lighting. James Wilson, a distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and kind eyes, had been Grandpa's friend since their college days. He greeted each of us personally, his handshake firm despite his age. When he came to me, he held my hand a moment longer. "Robert was so proud of you, Emily," he said quietly. "He spoke of you often." My parents arrived last, dressed as if for a society event rather than a will reading. My mother wore an expensive black dress with pearl earrings, while my father had chosen his best suit, the one reserved for meeting important clients. They nodded curtly to my father's siblings, Uncle David, Uncle Peter, and Aunt Sarah, before taking seats directly across from Mr. Wilson. The atmosphere crackled with tension beneath a veneer of forced pleasantries. My cousins shifted, uncomfortably in their chairs, clearly wishing they were elsewhere. Aunt Sarah kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Unlike my mother's performance, her grief for her brother seemed genuine. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Wilson began, placing a folder on the table before him. "As Robert's attorney and executor of his estate, I'll be reading his last will and testament in its entirety. Robert specifically requested that everyone named in the will be present for this reading." He opened the folder and put on reading glasses. "I'll begin with Robert's personal statement." Hearing Grandpa's words read in Mr. Wilson's steady voice brought a fresh wave of grief. Grandpa had written about his life's journey, his gratitude for family and friends, and his hope that his legacy would bring joy rather than discord. "To my son David and his wife Karen, I leave my collection of military memorabilia and $20,000, Mr. Wilson read. Uncle David nodded solemnly, his eyes glistening. "To my son Peter and his wife Janet, I leave my woodworking tools and $20,000. Uncle Peter smiled sadly, running a hand through his gray hair, so similar to Grandpa's. "To my daughter Sarah, I leave my late wife Margaret's jewelry collection and $20,000. Aunt Sarah pressed the tissue to her lips, shoulders shaking slightly. Various small bequests followed. Books to colleagues, specific furniture, pieces to friends, donations to organizations Grandpa had supported throughout his life. Each bequest came with a personal note explaining its significance. As the reading continued, my parents grew visibly restless. My father checked his watch repeatedly while my mother's artificial smile became increasingly strained. They exchanged glances whenever another item or modest sum was designated for someone else. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, remembering Grandpa's final months and the peace he had made with his decisions. Whatever he had chosen to do with his possessions, I knew his true legacy resided in the lessons he had taught me and the love we had shared. Finally, Mr. Wilson looked up from the document. Now, regarding the remainder of the estate, including the farmhouse property, all investments, and liquid assets totaling approximately $15 million. The room went completely still. My father leaned forward slightly, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. My mother's breathing quickened, her eyes fixed on the attorney. Robert has designated his granddaughter, Emily Elizabeth Watson, as the primary beneficiary. The silence shattered instantly. What? My father's voice cut through the room like a whip. Mr. Wilson continued as if there had been no interruption. The farmhouse and surrounding land, valued at approximately $2 million, transfers directly to Emily's ownership, along with all contents not specifically bequeathed to others. My mother's face had drained of color. "This can't be right," she whispered. "Additionally," Mr. Wilson proceeded, "all investment accounts, totaling approximately $4 million, are to be transferred to Emily's name." I sat in stunned silence. Though Grandpa had hinted at his intentions, I had never imagined the extent of his generosity or his wealth. "Finally," Mr. Wilson said, reaching into the folder, "there is the matter of liquid assets in the form of cash holdings." He withdrew a check and held it up. $9 million, payable to Emily Elizabeth Watson. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is outrageous. I'm his son. That money should rightfully come to me." Mr. Wilson remained perfectly composed. Robert was of sound mind when he made these decisions. "Thomas, the will has been properly executed with multiple witnesses, including his doctors who certified his mental competence." "She manipulated him," my mother accused, pointing a manicured finger at me. "While he was sick and vulnerable. She turned him against us." I finally found my voice. "I did no such thing." Mr. Wilson cleared his throat. "If I may continue, there are conditions attached to this bequest." This caught everyone's attention. My father slowly sat back down, eyes narrowed. "The funds are to be distributed as follows," Mr. Wilson explained. "Emily is to use $1 million for her education and personal security. $2 million is to be dedicated to preserving the farmhouse property and potentially establishing it as a nature conservancy, in keeping with her environmental work. $3 million is to be invested for her future and any family she may have. The remaining $3 million is to be used for charitable purposes of her choosing, with preference given to environmental education and conservation efforts." He handed me the check, which felt impossibly light for what it represented. "Robert wanted you to have the freedom to fulfill your potential without financial constraints, while also honoring the values he saw in you." I stared at the check. Grandpa's familiar signature bold at the bottom. This wasn't just money. It was his faith in me, his vision for what I might accomplish with the right resources. My father's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Let me see that," he demanded, reaching across the table. "This is absolutely ridiculous," my father snarled, standing again and pacing the length of the conference table. My father was clearly not in his right mind. No one leaves their entire fortune to a grandchild when they have children still living. My mother rose to join him, her designer heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. "We cared for him all these years. We're family. And he leaves everything to you?" She jabbed a finger in my direction, voice rising with each word. I remained seated, watching them with a strange detachment. Their outrage was exactly what Grandpa had predicted. Part of me felt sorry for them, so consumed by what they thought they deserved that they couldn't see how their own actions had led to this moment. "Mr. and Mrs. Watson, please," James Wilson interjected calmly. "Robert's decisions were deliberate and thoroughly considered. If you'd like to discuss the legal validity of the will, we can schedule a separate meeting with your attorney present." "I don't need another meeting," my father snapped. "I need to see that check." He strode around the table toward me, hand outstretched. Uncle David stood, placing himself partially between us. "Thomas, think about what you're doing. This isn't the way to handle this." "Stay out of this, David," my father warned. "You got your memorabilia and cash. This concerns my daughter and me." My cousins exchanged uncomfortable glances. Aunt Sarah was quietly crying now, witnessing her brothers, family fracturing before her eyes. "Emily," my mother said, suddenly shifting to a honeyed tone that I recognized from childhood manipulations. "Surely you understand this isn't what Grandpa really wanted. He was confused at the end. The medication affected his judgment. You know, the right thing would be to share this inheritance with your parents who raised you." I looked directly into her eyes, seeing the naked greed behind her practiced smile. Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing, Mom. He wasn't confused at all. You ungrateful little... My father lunged forward and snatched the check from my hand, before anyone could react. $9 million. Do you have any idea what I could do with this kind of money? The investments I've been planning for years? Thomas! Mr. Wilson's voice sharpened with authority. That check is Emily's legal property. Return it immediately or I'll be forced to call security. My father laughed bitterly, waving the check in the air. Call whoever you want. This will never stand up in court. I'll contest it, tie it up for years. You'll spend half of it on legal fees before you ever see a penny. My mother reached into her purse and produced a silver lighter, the expensive one my father had given her for their anniversary. Maybe we should just end this charade right now, she said, flicking it on. A small flame danced in the still air of the conference room. I felt strangely calm. Is that really what you want to do? Emily worked hard to help Grandpa in his final months, Uncle Peter said, his voice quiet but firm. She was there every day. Where were you two? Shut up, my father hissed. Then he looked at me, his expression hardening. Last chance, Emily. Agree to split this 50-50 or watch it burn. I simply folded my hands in my lap and waited. Something in my calm response seemed to infuriate him further. Fine, have it your way. He held the check up to my mother's lighter. The paper caught quickly, orange flames licking upward along its edges. Gasps echoed around the table. Mr. Wilson started to rise, but then caught my eye. I gave him the smallest shake of my head, and he settled back, watching intently. My parents' faces glowed with triumphant satisfaction as the check blackened and curled. They clearly expected me to lunge for it, to cry out, to beg them to stop. Instead, I smiled. That smile confused them. My father's brows furrowed as he dropped the burning remnants into a metal trash can beside the table. The flames consumed the last bits of paper, leaving only ashes. What's wrong with you? My mother demanded, her voice uncertain now. Do you think this is funny? We just burned $9 million. My smile widened. Did you really think Grandpa wouldn't anticipate exactly this kind of behavior? My father's face froze. What are you talking about? Mr. Wilson cleared his throat, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth as well. Perhaps this would be a good time to clarify something important. The check you just burned, Mr. Wilson said, opening his briefcase, was merely a copy, prepared specifically for this meeting. He pulled out another check, identical to the first but with the word original watermarked across it. This is the actual check, which will be deposited directly into a trust account established for Emily, as per Robert's instructions. The color drained from my father's face as he stared at the unburned check in Mr. Wilson's hand. My mother's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. Furthermore, Mr. Wilson continued, Robert anticipated potential contestation of his will. He included what we call a no-contest clause, which stipulates that any beneficiary who challenges the will's validity automatically forfeits their entire inheritance. He turned a page in the document before him. To quote directly, should any beneficiary contest this will or any provision herein, either directly or through instigation of another person, said beneficiary shall forfeit all interest in my estate and shall be treated as though they had predeceased me. My father lunged forward. Give me that check. 2 security guards appeared at the door immediately. They must have been stationed nearby, another of Grandpa's careful preparations. Mr. Watson, one guard said firmly, we need you to step back now. My father whirled to face me, his expression contorted with rage. You planned this. You set us up to look like fools. I shook my head. No, Dad. You did this to yourselves. Grandpa just knew you well enough to predict how you'd react. Mr. and Mrs. Watson, Mr. Wilson said, his voice steely now. I believe It would be best if you left the premises. My assistant will provide you with a copy of the will for your records, but I strongly advise against any attempts to contest it. Based on your behavior today alone, no court would look favorably on your case. This isn't over, my mother hissed as the security guards moved closer. We're your parents, Emily. You owe us. I owe you what you gave Grandpa in his final days, I replied quietly. Nothing. As the guards escorted my parents from the room, their threats and accusations echoed down the hallway. The remaining family members sat in stunned silence until the voices faded. Uncle David was the first to speak. Well, that was something I never thought I'd witness. He turned to me with sad eyes. I'm sorry, Emily. They weren't always like this. I know, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Perhaps they had always been this way, and I had simply been too young to see it clearly. After signing necessary paperwork and making arrangements for the formal transfer of assets, I left the law office feeling both vindicated and hollow. Winning against my parents brought no joy, only confirmation of how broken our family truly was. The following days brought a barrage of harassment, my phone filled with voicemails alternating between threats and tearful pleas. Text messages arrived at all hours, some demanding I make things right, others attempting to guilt me with reminders of sacrifices they claimed to have made for me. 3 days after the will reading, they showed up unannounced at my apartment building. The doorman, thankfully, refused to let them up, but I could hear my mother's shrill voice carrying through the lobby as I slipped out the back entrance. I met with Mr. Wilson again to discuss options. We can file for a restraining order, he advised. Given their behavior, a judge would likely grant it. I hope it doesn't come to that, I said, though the constant harassment was wearing me down. Unfortunately, Thomas and Diana have already contacted several attorneys about contesting the will, despite my warnings about the no contest clause. So they'll lose everything, I noted. Most likely, he confirmed. But that may not deter them, given the sums involved. When I wasn't dealing with my parents' attempts to contact me, I found myself drawn to Grandpa's farmhouse, now my farmhouse. The first time I drove up the familiar gravel driveway after the will reading, tears sprang to my eyes. Every tree, every flower bed, every weathered board of the porch held memories of time spent with him. Inside, everything remained exactly as he had left it. His reading glasses still rested on the side table next to his favorite armchair. The bookshelf we had built together still housed his collection of history books and field guides. The kitchen still smelled, faintly of coffee and peppermint. That first night alone in the house, I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, looking up at the stars as I had so often done with Grandpa. The telescope we had restored together still stood in its usual spot, aimed at the night sky. I miss you, I whispered to the darkness. Returning inside, I noticed a small wooden box on Grandpa's desk that I didn't remember seeing before. My name was carved into the lid in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a letter and a small wooden star pendant, similar to the one he had given me as a child, but more intricately carved. The letter, dated just 2 weeks before his passing, revealed that he had indeed anticipated everything that had transpired. My dearest stargazer, it began. If you're reading this, then events have likely unfolded as I expected. I'm sorry for the burden this inheritance may place on you, and especially for the conflict it will surely create with your parents. He explained that he had watched my parents' materialism and status-seeking grow over the years, despite his attempts to guide them toward more meaningful values. I could have left them the money, he wrote, but it would only have fueled the very qualities that have made them unhappy. Sometimes the kindest gift is not giving people what they think they want. His words brought fresh tears. You are the one who understood what truly matters in this life, Emily. Use these resources wisely, not just for yourself, but for the greater good. That is the true legacy I hope to leave through you. The letter concluded, "Remember that wealth, like poverty, tests character. Some fail the test of poverty through bitterness. Others fail the test of wealth through greed. Navigate this middle path with the compassion and integrity you've always shown. I will be watching from the stars. All my love, Grandpa." I clutched the letter to my chest, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the comfort of his continued guidance. The lawsuit arrived exactly as Mr. Wilson had predicted. Despite the clear no contest clause, my parents filed a petition to invalidate Grandpa's will, claiming undue influence and diminished capacity. The legal documents portrayed me as a manipulative caregiver who had isolated a vulnerable elderly man from his loving family in order to secure his fortune. Reading their allegations felt like being stabbed repeatedly. Every moment I had spent caring for Grandpa, every genuine conversation and shared experience was twisted into something calculating and sinister. "Try not to take it personally," Mr. Wilson advised when we met to discuss our response. "These are standard tactics in will contests. They don't reflect reality, only desperation." "But how can they believe these things?" I asked, still shocked by the viciousness of their claims. "I doubt they truly do," he replied gently. "When people want something badly enough, they can justify almost any action or belief that might help them get it." As the legal proceedings began, I learned more about my parents' financial situation through the discovery process. Despite their pretense of affluence, they had accumulated staggering debt. Their house carried 2 mortgages. Credit cards were maxed out. Loans had been taken against retirement accounts. They had been living beyond their means for decades, constructing an elaborate facade of wealth that was now on the verge of collapse. This revelation explained their desperation, but didn't excuse their actions. If anything, it confirmed Grandpa's wisdom in not leaving them his fortune. They would have burned through it maintaining appearances rather than building anything of substance. The stress of the lawsuit took its toll. I struggled to sleep, lost weight, and found it difficult to concentrate at work. My supervisor noticed and suggested I take a leave of absence. "Family legal battles are among life's most draining experiences," she said sympathetically. "Take the time you need." I decided to move into Grandpa's farmhouse permanently, both to escape my parents' continued attempts to contact me in the city and to find solace in the place where I felt closest to him. The familiar surroundings brought comfort, even as my parents' lawsuit cast a shadow over my inheritance of the property. One afternoon, returning from a grocery run, I found the front door of the farmhouse standing open. Heart pounding, I called the police from my car and waited until they arrived to enter. Inside, drawers had been emptied, furniture upended, and several valuable items taken. Grandma's silver service, Grandpa's collection of rare coins, and most painfully, the wooden star pendant Grandpa had left me in his final letter. The responding officer took notes as I identified the missing items. "Any idea who might have done this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I hesitated only briefly before saying, "My parents would have had keys to the house from when my grandfather was alive." The theft report led to a search warrant for my parents' home. The police recovered most of the stolen items, including, thankfully, the wooden star pendant. My parents were charged with breaking and entering and theft, adding criminal proceedings to the ongoing civil case. I couldn't bring myself to attend their arraignment. Instead, I channeled my energy into securing the farmhouse, installing a comprehensive security system with cameras and changing all the locks. The caretaker's cottage at the edge of the property, previously unused for years, became home to Sam, a retired police officer looking for part-time work in exchange for reduced rent. His presence provided additional security and eased my anxiety about being alone on the property. As the court date for the will contest approached, I spent hours helping Mr. Wilson prepare our case. We gathered medical records confirming Grandpa's mental clarity until his final days. We collected statements from his doctors, nurses, and friends who had witnessed our relationship and his decision-making process. Most valuable of all was a discovery I made while organizing Grandpa's study. Behind his collection of leather-bound classics, I found a series of journals spanning the last decade of his life. Within these pages, Grandpa had documented his observations, thoughts and concerns about family dynamics in meticulous detail. He described my parents' infrequent visits, their transparent interest in his assets, and their dismissive treatment of him. He noted specific dates, conversations, and incidents that painted a clear picture of their neglect and materialism. But he also wrote about his concerns for them, his attempts to guide them toward more meaningful priorities, and his eventual acceptance that they had chosen their path. In contrast, the journal entries about our time together were filled with warmth, detailing our conversations, shared projects, and the values he hoped to instill in me. His decision to make me his primary beneficiary had not been impulsive or influenced by illness, but carefully considered over years. These journals became the centerpiece of our legal defense. Mr. Wilson believed they would be virtually unassailable evidence of Robert's intentions and mental capacity. The courtroom confrontation proved even more dramatic than anticipated. My parents arrived impeccably dressed, presenting themselves as grieving, bewildered victims of a scheming daughter. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as my father testified about their close relationship with Grandpa and their complete shock at being disinherited in favor of an inexperienced young person who couldn't possibly manage such wealth responsibly. Their attorney, a sharp-featured woman with predatory eyes, attempted to paint Grandpa as a confused old man and me as a manipulative caregiver. Emily Watson saw an opportunity with her ailing grandfather, she argued. She isolated him from family, planted seeds of discord, and positioned herself to benefit from his diminished capacity. When my turn came to testify, I spoke directly and honestly about my relationship with Grandpa, our shared values, and his clear-minded decisions in his final months. I described finding him confused only once, when his medication had been adjusted, and how he had immediately consulted his doctor to address the issue. My grandfather knew exactly what he was doing, I concluded. He made his choices based on relationships built over a lifetime, not on biology or obligation. The most damning testimony, however, came from Grandpa himself, through his journals. As Mr. Wilson read selected entries aloud, my father's face darkened with rage while my mother's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. November 15th, Mr. Wilson read. Thomas and Diana visited today, their first appearance in nearly 4 months. Thomas immediately began asking about my investments, suggesting I should modernize my portfolio. When I changed the subject to Emily's recent research publication, they could barely conceal their disinterest. They stayed exactly 45 minutes before Diana suddenly remembered a social engagement. In contrast, Emily calls daily and visits 4 times weekly, genuinely interested in my well-being rather than my bank accounts. The entries continued, creating an undeniable portrait of 2 very different relationships, one based on authentic care, the other on financial interest. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened attentively to all testimony, but seemed particularly moved by the journals. When my parents' attorney attempted to suggest the journals might have been fabricated, the judge cut her off sharply. I've reviewed the handwriting analysis report, counselor. The authenticity of these documents is not in question. In her ruling, delivered after just 2 days of deliberation, the judge not only upheld Grandpa's will in its entirety, but issued a stinging rebuke to my parents for their transparent attempt to circumvent the clearly expressed wishes of the deceased and the no-contest clause they were well aware of. As a result, they forfeited even the modest $20,000 bequest Grandpa had left them. The criminal charges for the break-in remained pending, with a separate court date set for the following month. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, drawn by the dramatic story of family betrayal and the substantial sums involved. I slipped out a side entrance, unwilling to make a public spectacle of what was already the most painful chapter of my life. 6 months after the court ruling, the farmhouse had become truly mine in more than just legal terms. I had preserved Grandpa's spaces while gradually adding my own touches. Research books beside his history volumes, my collection of native plant specimens in the sunroom, a new cushion on the window seat where I often sat to watch birds at the feeders. The property itself was undergoing thoughtful transformation. Working with a conservation trust, I had established most of the land as a permanent nature preserve, protecting it from the development that had swallowed neighboring properties. A small educational center near the entrance welcomed school groups and community members to learn about local ecosystems and sustainable practices. Following Grandpa's wishes, I had allocated the inheritance with care. $1 million for personal. Security had allowed me to pay off student loans, create an emergency fund, and make some modest updates to the farmhouse's aging systems. $2 million went toward establishing and endowing the nature preserve. $3 million was conservatively invested for future needs. The final $3 million funded the Robert Watson Scholarship for Environmental Studies, supporting students who, like me, wanted to dedicate their careers to conservation. The first class of 5 scholarship recipients had already been selected, bright young minds who reminded me of myself at their age. Throughout this period of external progress, my inner healing moved at a slower pace. The betrayal by my parents had left wounds that needed time to mend. I began working with a therapist who specialized in family estrangement, gradually processing the complex emotions of grief, anger, disappointment, and guilt. It's normal to still love them while acknowledging the harm they've caused, Dr. Mercer explained during one particularly difficult session. Those feelings aren't contradictory. They're part of the complicated reality of family relationships. I had maintained firm boundaries with my parents since the court case. They had both received probation for the break-in, avoiding jail time but acquiring criminal records that devastated their social standing. The financial collapse they had feared materialized when creditors called in loans they couldn't repay. Their house was foreclosed upon, luxury cars repossessed, and country club memberships revoked. 3 months after the trial, I received the first letter from my mother that didn't contain accusations or demands. Instead, it held something resembling an apology, though still laced with justifications and subtle attempts to elicit pity. My father followed with a similar letter weeks later, suggesting a meeting to put the past behind us. Dr. Mercer helped me craft responses that were neither vindictive nor naive. You can acknowledge their steps toward reconciliation without dropping all boundaries, she advised. True rebuilding of trust requires consistent change over time, not just words on paper when someone is in crisis. I agreed to meet them at a neutral location, a quiet cafe halfway between the farmhouse and the small apartment they now rented. The meeting was awkward, tense, and brief. They looked older, subdued by circumstances and consequences. My father had taken a position at a small financial firm, a significant step down from his previous role. My mother had started part-time work at a department store, an experience she described as humbling. "We've had time to think," my father said, his usual confidence notably diminished. "We didn't handle things well." "That's an understatement," I replied, not unkindly but unwilling to pretend their actions had been minor transgressions. "We were wrong," my mother added, eyes downcast. "About many things, not just the will and what happened after, but about what really matters." I nodded, acknowledging their words without fully accepting them as complete atonement. "This will take time," I told them. "I'm willing to try small steps, but I need to see consistent change, not just hear about it." We agreed to occasional phone calls and potential future meetings, a tentative rebuilding that would depend entirely on their continued demonstration of changed perspectives and behavior. As spring returned to the farmhouse, bringing new growth, to gardens Grandpa had lovingly tended for decades, I found myself increasingly at peace with all that had happened. The property had become a place of healing not just for me, but for the broader community. One Saturday morning, as I was repairing a section of fencing that bordered the woods, a truck pulled into the driveway. A man about my age stepped out, carrying a toolbox. "You must be Emily," he said, extending his hand. "I'm John Mercer. My company's doing the renovation work on the caretaker's cottage. Sam mentioned the fence needed some work, and I had some extra time this morning." I recognized the name from the contracting paperwork, but hadn't met him personally yet. "That's really kind of you, but you don't have to do that on a weekend." He smiled, revealing a slight dimple in his right cheek. "I don't mind. This property is special. My grandfather used to bring me fishing at the pond here when I was a kid. Your grandfather always made us feel welcome." This connection to Grandpa's generosity felt like a gift. We spent the morning working side by side on the fence, conversation flowing easily from work to shared memories of the property to our respective paths in life. John had taken over his family's construction business after college, shifting its focus towards sustainable building practices and historic preservation. "Places like this deserve to be maintained properly," he said, gesturing toward the farmhouse. "There's craftsmanship here you can't replicate today." His appreciation for the property's history and character resonated with my own feelings. When we finished the fence repair, I invited him in for lunch, the first guest I'd entertained since moving in permanently. We ate sandwiches on the back porch, watching birds at the feeders and talking about his ideas for respectfully updating the caretaker's cottage while preserving its original charm. As weeks passed, John became a regular presence at the farmhouse, his initial work on the cottage expanding to include other needed repairs and improvements. Our professional relationship gradually evolved into friendship based on shared values and mutual respect. Unlike my parents and their social circle, who measured worth by possessions and status, John valued craftsmanship, integrity, and stewardship of the natural world, qualities Grandpa would have appreciated. One evening in late spring, I set up Grandpa's old telescope on the hill behind the house. The Lyrid meteor shower was peaking, and the clear night promised excellent viewing conditions. As I adjusted the focus, I heard the crunch of gravel on the path. "Hope I'm not intruding," John said, approaching with 2 thermoses. "Sam mentioned you were planning to watch the meteor shower, and I thought you might like some coffee. It gets chilly up here after sunset." The thoughtful gesture touched me. "I'd welcome the company," I replied, accepting one of the thermoses. Grandpa and I used to watch meteor showers together. He called them nature's fireworks show. We spread a blanket on the grass and lay back to watch the celestial display. Between meteors streaking across the darkness, we talked about everything and nothing: childhood memories, future dreams, favorite books, and the simple pleasure of witnessing the universe's vastness together. "Your grandfather would be proud of what you're doing here," John said quietly during a lull in conversation. "Creating something meaningful and lasting." "I hope so," I replied, feeling Grandpa's presence almost tangibly in the starlit night. He taught me that the true value of any inheritance isn't measured in dollars, but in what you build with it. In that moment, watching stars shoot across the sky from the same spot where Grandpa had first shown me the constellations, I felt a sense of completion. The inheritance that mattered most wasn't the money or property, but the wisdom to use resources for something greater than myself. The legal battles and family fractures had been painful, but they had ultimately led me exactly where I needed to be. Grandpa had known all along what my parents never understood. Money simply amplifies who you already are. In their hands, wealth would have fueled more empty status-seeking. In mine, it could create preservation, education, and opportunity for others. This wasn't a victory over my parents, but a fulfillment of Grandpa's vision for a legacy that extended beyond material possessions. As another meteor traced a brilliant path across the night sky, I silently thanked Grandpa for his final gift, not the check my parents had so dramatically burned, but the understanding that our most valuable inheritance is how we choose to live our values in a world that often measures worth by all the wrong standards. Have you ever had to stand your ground against family who confused money with love? What would you do with an unexpected inheritance that came with strings attached? Drop a comment below, hit like if this story resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories about finding strength through life's most challenging moments. Thank you for watching, and remember, the true measure of wealth isn't in your bank account, but in how you use what you've been given to make a difference.